Hi, welcome back to UI class. Today we are going to revisit about why raising interest rate can curb inflation. But then we have a very interesting comparison today because in the US, when the inflation rate is relatively high, so raising interest rate is set to be able to curb inflation. But then currently in Hong Kong, the inflation is relatively mild. Then what would result if Hong Kong has to follow the US to increase interest rate? So let's go back to the recent event first. On March 16, the US Federal Reserve announced a 0.25% rate hike, which basically is in line with the market expectations, as the Fed had already warned that from March, then there would have several rounds of interest rate increase. But then it's a very important change because this is the first rate hike since the normalization process of interest rate was stopped in 2019. Even though, right, you can say 0.25% rate hike is very mild, but the Fed had also announced that there will be another 6 rounds of rate increase in 2022. So it becomes a market expectations of interest rate increase rapidly in the coming months. So that is forming a kind of market expectation that the Fed is mobilizing all the resources, especially by using the monetary tools to contain the inflation. So I think all of you have heard about the latest US inflation rate in February that has already been risen to 7.9%. So this kind of rapid deterioration of inflation in the US, which break the record of the past 40 years, making the Fed no room to maneuver, but to increase interest rate as fast as possible. So increasing interest rate is a common phenomenon. After the outbreak of COVID-19, many countries indeed had already raised interest rate to curb inflation already. But then, as I mentioned, the situation in Hong Kong is quite different. The latest report, the inflation rate in January was just about 1.2%. The government has even implemented measures to boost the economy, right, including a distribution of $10,000 electronic currency to all adults in Hong Kong. Basically, people would say, hey, with such a recessionary economy in Hong Kong, right, the interest rate should be reduced. However, because of the linked exchange rate mechanism, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority announced it to follow the US Federal Reserve decisions to raise interest rate by 0.25% almost at the same time. So raising interest rate is to cool down the economy so as to curb inflation. But then when Hong Kong's situation is recessionary, but due to the currency board arrangement or the linked exchange rate, then the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has to follow the rate hike in the US, which will likely lead a deflation. Then, of course, the first question is whether you believe that raising interest rate can curb inflation. So if you don't, you are not alone, because many people also disagree that raising interest rate can curb inflation, because inflation refers to a general increase in prices, including all daily necessities, everything. So that's the reason why the statistics department usually would count a basket of goods and take the average or the weighted average of their price changes every month to report their consumer price index so as to estimate the inflation rate. So during the period of high inflation, then the living expenses of the citizens will be increasing continuously. And then people will say, hey, you should help to stop the rise in prices. Why? Instead, you try to increase interest rate. Increasing interest rate would make the situation even worse. it makes the life of people in debt even more difficult. Many people, let's say, for example, they are paying mortgage every month, or they are repaying loans every month. So increasing interest rate will make people's life even more terrible. So why the government and the central bank do not help stop the price increase, but instead increase interest rate further, which sounds counterintuitive. So many people do not agree or do not understand why raising interest rate can curb inflation, and why governments should raise interest rate during period of high inflation rather than reducing prices. So let's go into a recent typical example, which the president of Turkey also disagree with this monetary theory that raising interest rate can curb inflation. He does not agree on this theory. Instead, he even ordered a reduction of policy rate by 100 basis points to 14% interest rate when inflation rate exceed 20% at the end of last year. So you can refer back to my previous paper, to the link down below. And here show a recent real-life example when a government tried to reduce interest rate in response to a high inflation. Then let's see what happened. So after 3 months now, Turkey's latest inflation rate in February rose sharply to 54.44%, an increase of nearly 1.5 times in just a quarter. The inflation rate in the same period last year was only 15.6%. From 15.6% after the year, it had increased it to 54.44%. There is an increase of 3.5 times in 1 year. So Turkey's experiment on real interest rate theory once again proved that cutting interest rate will only lead to high inflation. So let me show you the figure about Turkey's inflation. Here you will find a chart. Indeed, even before the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, even in January 2022, the inflation rate of Turkey has already increased to 48.69%. So it indicates that the sharp increase of inflation rate in Turkey is not caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. The chart shows a continuous sharp increase even before February 24th, the day when Russia invaded Ukraine. There has been reported that Turkey's government has made an announcement, try to restore citizens' confidence in the currency by providing a guarantee that they can exchange lira to US dollar at a fixed exchange rate in the future, and trying to stop the depreciation of the currency. But unfortunately, indeed, it is not able to prevent the decline of the Turkish lira. So then there are basically 4 major methods to curb inflation. And they are, first, restricting price increase by authority. Second, increasing the supply of goods. Thirdly, reducing the demand for goods. And fourthly, reducing the money supply. The first 3 are easier said than done, while the fourth can generally be achieved by raising interest rate. So let's go into them one by one. When inflation is defined as a general increase in price, then the most direct response would be stop price increase. This becomes a very common tactic in authoritarian countries by enacting laws or by releasing a new order to disallow any price increase. Then inflation will return to 0 or even negative, right? It's not straightforward and easy. Why not? Then why? It's not common in most Western countries. But that's the reason why the monetary theory argued that inflation is not about rise in price, but a depreciation of the currency, right? Because the government has increased too much money, right? Or too much currency. So now when there are too much currency chasing too little goods, right? The same quantity of currency can now exchange for less goods. That would be the consequence. But now, if the prices of goods are not allowed to rise by laws, it will only lead to either the emergence of a black market or the suppliers will stop selling goods. It's because suppliers will not be willing to sell their precious goods in exchange for some less valuable currencies. So that's why inflation is always an expectation issue. So when sellers expect a depreciating currency, then they would not be willing to sell their precious goods at the same price. Then, right, people keep on saying that, hey, it's easy to handle inflation, just increase the supply. Say, for example, when property price in Hong Kong has been rising continuously in the past decade, so people, economists, government officials keep on saying that, hey, the only reason for property price rise is insufficient supply, property supply. So then they keep on urging the government to increase supply. And after so-called increasing property supply for decades, but the problem of high property prices has not been solved. This is clearly because the money supply is much, much faster than the property supply, right? How can you increase property supply faster than the increase in money supply? Unless there are some special reasons, say, for example, a technological breakthrough or say breaking a monopoly. Otherwise, it's hard to curb inflation simply by increasing goods supply. So take the current inflation as an example, right? Oil price rise is the main cause. Everyone knows that. And indeed, oil price has been rising to $120 US per barrel now. But then the question is, why the OPEC+, why the oil export countries do not increase supplies to deal with the inflation issue, right? Indeed, they are monopolistic oil exporting countries, right? It's unlikely to solve the problem by increasing oil supply, right? They have their own incentive and they are beneficiaries of oil price increase. Then if we cannot urge suppliers to increase supply, why don't we reduce our demand? If we can reduce our demand, if we don't buy anything, then the price of goods could never be increased. But in reality, it is difficult, if not impossible, to request a substantial reduction in consumers' demand. Right? On the one hand, many goods are necessities, say for example, oil and natural gas. People generally can hardly reduce the demand. Right? In the past decade, right, it's evident from the experience of environmental protections that asking people to reduce their demand could hardly be achieved voluntarily. Then people will say, hey, we can stop or reduce demand by administrative orders. Yes, but then the situation is like rationing, right? Such as issuing shopping coupons with some upper limit, like food stamps. It will inevitably incur huge transaction costs and cause unnecessary waste. So that's the reason why, indeed, the most efficient and commonly used approach to tackle inflation is increasing interest rate. Raising interest rate is a better approach to curb inflation because of two reasons. First, it can directly reduce the money supply. Second, it uses market forces to attract savings with higher interest rate, thereby encouraging the reduction of consumption by market mechanism. It can minimize unnecessary transaction costs. It reduces waste. The reason why raising interest rate can directly reduce money supply is because since the cancellation of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, which turned the world into a fiat money system, money supply now is no longer limited by any standard commodity. And it can basically be increased at will by bankers. At the level of retail banks, lending money is equivalent to increasing money supply. Recovering loans is equivalent to reducing money supply. So as long as the interest rate is adjusted, then the demand for loans can be effectively adjusted to achieve the effect of adjusting money supply. So that's the mechanism. After 1971, right, in the fiat money world, interest rate becomes a market mechanism, work like a lever, trying to adjust the demand for money supply. But then going back to the situation in Hong Kong, since raising interest rate will reduce money supply, the purpose is to curb inflation, but currently Hong Kong's economy is relatively weak and inflation is relatively mild. Raising interest rate may further depress the current moderate inflation and turn it into deflation or even depression. So in fact, the financial secretary of Hong Kong has just announced it to distribute $10,000 of electronic money to every adult in the city this year. The purpose is to boost the weak economy, which is contradictory to the purpose of raising interest rate. So it becomes a mismatch, right? This kind of mismatch is the consequence of the link exchange rate system. Right? In the past few years, when Hong Kong's inflation rate was higher than that of the US, then interest rate cut can stimulate Hong Kong's economy. And it results in an overheated economy, especially in property price. But now, when the inflation of Hong Kong is lower than that of the United States, but still, because of the link exchange rate systems, Hong Kong has to follow the interest rate hike in the US. Then it will make Hong Kong economies even worse and weaken the effect of the helicopter money distribution scheme. So let's see whether the event will be unfolded in this direction. That's all for today. Thank you.